That. This game is a very powerful illustration of the rooks on the open files and the power of when you have both bishops in the middle game. So I'm very excited to show you this game. So I was playing white and I opened with e4. I've been playing a lot of openings with e4 lately and I'm really enjoying it more than d4. Maybe I'll switch back to it, but I'm sticking with e4 for now. My opponent plays b6. Now he's obviously going to want to fianchetto his bishop right here on b7, and that will give him some center influence, but I don't believe the fianchettoed bishop hits the center as much as when you play these kinds of moves like the center pawns and bringing your knights up. I think these types of moves are superior to fianchettoing your bishops. So I played knight f3, and he fianchettos his bishop, giving him a long diagonal, coming at my e4 pawn. So I've got to protect it in some way, and I do. I bring my other knight out. So my knights are developed, hitting the center. Always want to control the center of the board. And he plays g6. He's going to fianchetto his other bishop, and I don't believe that this is a very good strategy. It's one thing to fianchetto one bishop, which is okay, right? But to fianchetto your second bishop, you're wasting 2 more moves just to get your other bishop out, and they're x-raying each other, the 2 bishops. They're not going to they're not really working together as much as when you have your 2 bishops. I'll show you what I mean in a second. So I bring my bishop up to c4. Now at this point, I believe that this bishop here is the most powerful piece on the board right now. It's exerting a very powerful diagonal toward his king side and heading straight toward that weak f7 pawn. That's the weakest pawn on the board because it's only protected by the king. So I believe this is the strongest piece on the board as of now. And then he fianchettos his other bishop. Now this bishop is, I think it's more powerful than this bishop here, and he is targeting my knight, which is is the only defender of this pawn, which is being attacked. So I've got to protect that pawn like that. So I solidify my center. All right. So I believe I have a much better position than my opponent right now. And he takes my knight, and I retake his bishop. So now he's produced weaknesses on his king side because there's no bishop there. And I've got doubled pawns here, but I am controlling central squares, and I have an open file right here. This open file can be very powerful, and I use it later on in the game. And then he brings his pawn up to e6, and he's really weakening a lot of his dark squares. He's weakened this one very much, just because he pushed his pawn here, and this one is also very weak. Just the entire dark square complex around his king is becoming very weak, and I make a plan on how to exploit those weak squares, but I don't end up doing it. Well, we'll see what happens later on. So I castle. I go ahead and castle. Always a good idea to castle early, get the king into safety. He pulls his knight to e7. That's fine. And I pull my bishop up. Now what I was thinking here, even though the bishop is blocked with this pawn and that pawn is being blocked by the bishop, what I was thinking was the bishop is cutting right through his king side. So what I was thinking was I could bring my queen up, put her right there, bring the bishop back, push the pawn, and then I have a checkmate threat right there. If he decides to castle, I have a checkmate threat. So that was my thinking behind moving my bishop up here to get an angle toward his king. Then he castles, right? So that is an even greater incentive for me to go after the king's side. And as you can see, all my pieces are generally pointing that direction. My bishop here, my other bishop, the knight, is able to get to the king's side pretty quickly, as well as my queen. And this rook here can also get up if I decide to open some files. Then I press my queen to d2, of course, getting that angle. And he presses his pawn to d6, right? Just to get some central control. He's got a pretty good pawn wall, although he's weakened this square. Let's see, d6. Yeah, I put my bishop here so I can press this pawn and get that angle with my bishops. So you can see my bishops are becoming really powerful. Also, I have the 2 bishops and 1 knight. My opponent has the 2 knights. 2 knights and 1 bishop. So that is a difference. So I have the 2 bishops, so I'm going to want to use these bishops as much as I can. This knight doesn't have too much of an effect on the game, although I do bring it in later on. This knight mainly acts as a guardian of my king, and he fulfills his role very well in that aspect. So anyway, after I push my queen to d2, he pushes d6, bishop b3, e5. So he's coming up the center, right? And he closes off my bishop on this diagonal, right? He blocks my bishop in with that pawn. So at this point, I'm thinking, okay, well the king, I'm not really able to get to his king anymore because my the bishops aren't going to be able to get over there. In the meantime, we'll see what happens here. So he pushes e5, then I go d4, right? So I would like to exchange some of the pawns and rip open this center so that I can use my bishops. And if he does not take the pawn, then I have another option of what I can do, which he does not take the pawn. Instead, let's see here. He brings his knight right to here. That's where he puts his knight. He does not bring his undeveloped knight to the square. Well, I suppose that doesn't do any good either because he can't bring his knight back because his queen and bishop block that area. So he brings his knight that's already developed into here, and this doesn't do him any good because then I press my pawn to threaten his knight, and then he has to move his knight back. So he's given me 2 moves. He's given me 2 free moves. And now, because my pawns are pointing this direction and all of my pieces are coming up to this side, I can bring my rooks and push my pawns. I'm going to play on the queen side, and this is my long-term plan that I use for this game. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to play on the queen side. I have more space on the queen side, so I'm going to play into the queen side. Alright, so he moves his knight back, and I put my bishop here. Then he presses his pawn to f6 to try and stop my queen from coming to here and bringing my bishop right to here. That pawn covers that square, so I can't do a kingside attack, although he is really weakening his kingside with these pawns he's pushing. But still, there isn't much potential for me on the king side. I'm going to go on the queen side. So let's see, f6, then queen e2, no, queen e2 there, right? Let's see here, queen e2, then he presses his pawn to c6, and he's attacking my pawns, my pawn chain, so I want to protect my pawn chain. I don't want to disrupt the pawn closedness so that he doesn't, I don't want him to come into the center and push pawns and do all kinds of stuff. I want to keep the center close so that I can continue my wing attack on the queen side. So I want to protect it with a pawn, and he takes the pawn, and I take it with my pawn that I press to protect that pawn. And now we can still see that the center is still very closed. And even though I only have one knight and my opponent has two knights, so theoretically he should be able to get the better hand at this position, he doesn't end up using his knights at all. He makes one good move with his knight, and the other knight just stays on the same square for the entire game. My bishops, even though it's a closed center, my bishops prove to be vastly superior to anything my opponent has, including his knights. My bishops prove superior to my knight also. So we will see how that turns out. So I take his pawn, and then I almost made a critical mistake here. He brings his bishop up to a6, and he's got a beautiful skewer on my queen and rook. If I move my queen, he snaps off my rook, and he wins the exchange. So I was feeling pretty nervous, but I realized that I can get out of this. I can block the skewer with my bishop, and that prevents him from coming in. He brings his pawn up to threaten my bishop. I go ahead and take his pawn, and he brings his bishop back to the fianchetto. Now, here I either think he should have swapped my bishop or brought his bishop back to f1, to c8, sorry. I think he should have brought it back to here, because on this diagonal there's no potential for this bishop on this long diagonal. None. The center is completely blocking that bishop in. Whereas here, he has a much better angle. He can come all the way down to here on this f8, h3 diagonal. That is a much better place for that bishop. If he could bring it down to here, and come for a kingside attack. His pawns are pointing to my kingside. He could really generate some energy on the kingside, but he doesn't do that, which is, of course, good for me. I can continue with my plan, and he doesn't continue with his plan. So he brings his bishop back to the diagonal, and then I bring my bishop up to e3, and this bishop is extremely well centralized. He has magnificent angles both directions. That's a great bishop right there. So I bring my bishop, and then he threatens my bishop, and I bring my bishop back. These two bishops are so powerful. They are having a lot of influence. You can see this bishop going this way, this bishop that way, and the two bishops pointing that way and that way. Those bishops, even though this is a closed center, the bishops are having a lot of range on the wings of the board. If you can get your bishops like this, the bishops are very powerful that way. So he pulls his knight to d7. Now, I have weaknesses on this c file. My c pawn is extremely weak. This square, the c5 square, he has control with his pawn, and he can bring his knight onto that outpost, and he could have a good thing going for him on the queen side, even though this is my area. I'm gonna play on this side, but still, that's a great spot for that knight. And if he really wanted to, he could bring his rook to c8 and come at this pawn with both his rooks and his knights. He could really get something going here, but he doesn't do that, which is good for me, of course. So he puts his knight on d7, and I'm going to push for more space on the queen side. And then he, of course, puts his knight on c5. That is a great spot for that knight. He's attacking my bishop. He's attacking my pawn. You can see this knight has a radiating influence all the way around this side. You can see the range of influence. That knight is very powerful. I would love to get rid of that knight, but I don't want to lose my bishops. But here the thing is, if he comes and takes this bishop, my light squared bishop, is on the light square. It's on the same color as my central pawns. So this makes my light squared bishop my bad bishop, and my dark squared bishop is my good bishop. So he's going to take his powerful knight and trade it in for my bad bishop. Even though it's a strong bishop, I would like to get rid of my bad bishop for his powerful knight, and that's exactly what he does. Well, here, let me see. So, knight d7, a4, knight d. I bring my knight to d2. That's what I do right there. I need to get my knight into this queenside thrust. My knight here was not doing very much at all. He was just protecting my king, and there was nothing coming after my king. So it's time to bring my knight into the game. And sure enough, he takes my bishop with his knight. And so I retake his knight. And then he pushes his pawn to a5, meeting me on the queen side here. And then I want my knight on this outpost right here on b5. That would be a pretty good spot for my knight. That would be a really good spot because his pawns are past my knight. He will never be able to chase my knight away from that square. So the quickest way to get to that square with my knight is to come to b1, and then he brings his queen up, and then I come to here, c3, and then he brings his bishop back to a6, and he skewers my queen and rook again, and I was just pretty flustered at this, but again, I have a defense against it. I can bring my knight, so thank goodness I was able, I had my knight there so that I could block it. So that was a very good thing. I was happy with that. And he takes the knight, and I took it with the pawn. Now I have an absolutely screaming passed pawn, and I can use my rooks to back up that pawn, and use my bishop and my queen, and I can really get this on the queen side. I have a much superior position because I've been working on the queen side with all my pieces and my pawns and my knight and bishops. This is great. So I take it with the pawn, and then he brings his rook behind his queen. Now this is interesting. He's getting a lot of pressure down here on my pawn, and that's my weakness. So I just protect the pawn with my rook. I don't want to lose a pawn. I don't want to completely go on defensive, though. I really don't want to go on defensive. So I try my best not to go on the defense and just protect the pawn, right? Just protect my weakness. And then he brings his rook down here, attacking my pawn. Now it is defended by the queen, so that's fine. But I decide to go on the attack. I bring my pawn up, threatening his queen. Offense is the best defense. That's the thing. If you're being threatened, you should try to make a move that forces your opponent to do something and go on. And instead of going on the defense, go on the offense. So that's what I do here. Instead of protecting my pawn, I threaten his queen. And the pawn is protected by the bishop. So that's good. He brought his queen here. And I don't know, I'm not really sure. I was thinking about making this move, which I did. I guess I didn't think of how the bishop was covering that pawn. So he can't take it with his queen, because then I'd take it with the bishop. But I made this move. And then he brought his queen here, challenging my queen. Now my queen is protected by the pawn, his queen is protected by his rook. And here's another thing about this position. If I take his queen, he'll take my queen with his rook, and he'll have pretty good combat against my pawn, my passed pawn. If he takes my queen, I can take it with the pawn, and I'd have two very powerful open files that I can use with my rooks, and his rooks will be very passive. So that is what I want to do. Always, if you have the option to make an exchange like this, don't do it. Let your opponent make the exchange. That's another important chess rule. To take is a mistake. Just think of that, right? You let your opponent make the exchanges. So in this case, I just played this waiting move, f3, supporting my center, getting a pawn chain, and letting him exchange the queens, which he does. And now I'm pretty much in a 1 position at this point. So I take his queen, and then he brings his rook to b7, just blocking my pawn, and then I bring that rook completely up into there, and I acquire the 7th rank with the rook. I acquire the 7th rank, and this is extremely critical to do. You must obtain the 7th rank with the rooks. This is where the rook acquires the zenith of its power on the 7th rank. So now, once again, we have another situation where my opponent doesn't have to make this exchange. He can defend, which is the better thing to do, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he takes the rook, and it weakens him to take. When he exchanged the queen, it weakens him because I have the open files. When he exchanges the rook, it weakens him because my pawn is 1 step closer to the queening square on c8. And at this point, if he just makes a random move like this, and I bring my rook to the 8th rank, I check, and the game's over at this point. The game is absolutely over because I'm attacking his rook, he takes mine, and I promote to a queen, and the game's over. So, he moved his king to prevent the check, and I can still make this move. And it was at this point in time that my opponent resigned. So that's a very powerful game that illustrates the rooks on the open files and why you should not make the exchanges. You should let your opponent make the exchanges because it will benefit you if you let your opponent make the exchanges. Don't make the exchanges yourself because it will help your opponent get a better position. And also, I expanded on the queen side. Even until the very end of the game, you can clearly see that my queen side imbalance worked. And that is what I did, and it works. So that's a